Today I'm going to tell you an amazing story. After this story, you will see the world a little from an unusual side. You will perceive such familiar words as tobacco and incense in a different way, and understand why people were so willing to go to the new church, and why there are almost no people in modern churches. And that's what's important. Everything I'm going to tell you today, I strongly condemn and do not call for anything. So, let's get started. The history of mankind sometimes strikes with strange and at first glance, curious facts. In 1604 year, King James I of England published a pamphlet on the dangers of tobacco, where he wrote, "Smoking is a custom disgusting to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs." Just wonderful words. I just wonder how Jacob first learned that smoking harms the lungs. After all, as historians tell us, life expectancy in the 17th century was no more than 40 years. And the negative effects of smoking in an ordinary person appear only after 40. There will be shortness of breath, cough, decreased performance. So, King James wrote that tobacco harms the brain and lungs. With the lungs too, an interesting question, but let's not find fault, but let's see what other monarchs wrote about it. 1606 year, King Philip III of Spain issued a decree restricting the cultivation of tobacco. 1634 year, Tsar Mikhail Fedorovich issued a decree, according to which smokers and tobacco sellers were supposed to pull out their nostrils, repeat offenders. Chop off heads. All this, of course, is good that back in the 17th century, the monarchs of the whole world were fighting tobacco smoking, taking care, so to speak, of the health of citizens. Only here, it all looks quite strange. Tobacco smoking, of course, has its negative consequences, but this habit usually does not interfere with either work or public order. Everything is calm in the 17th century. A person smokes a pipe, goes to work, plows fields, participates in hostilities. By the age of 40, he dies. Since, according to historians, at that time everyone lived no more than 40 years. So, the habit, though harmful, but the smoking man, did not prevent either the monarchs or the manufacturers from squeezing all the juices out of him. In other words, we see a clear discrepancy. There is a fairly harmless habit of smoking tobacco for public order. A smoker goes to work, supports a family, does not scold the authorities, and does not hooliganize. In other words, it is almost no different from the average inhabitant of the Middle Ages. So why did Tsar Mikhail Fedorovich offer to pull out his nostrils, seemingly harmless to others? And here lies one of the terrible secrets of the past centuries. And what did people actually smoke, snort, and drink? It was drinking, because the rather ridiculous expression to drink tobacco has been preserved. Not all kings struggled with the bad habit, and in the foreground of tobacco addiction agitation was Peter the Great. It was he who began to inculcate tobacco smoking in backward Russia as a fashionable element of European culture. Peter not only smoked and snuffed tobacco himself, he forced others to do it, generously distributing Indian potion at assemblies. Here it is necessary to pay attention to important keywords. Snuffed tobacco, an Indian potion. Nowadays, it is very rare for anyone to take snuff. After all, this is a completely useless action in relation to tobacco. Tobacco can certainly be sniffed, but this action will not produce any bright effect. But, in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were popular elegant snuff boxes, from which tobacco was sniffed. At first glance, it's just a fashion accessory. Everyone is sniffing the stinking grass, and I'm going to smell it. After all, there will be no effect anyway. But, I doubt very much about the lack of effect. After all, man is a very gentle and spoiled animal who loves to find new pleasure, that is, to load his brain with changeable states. For example, Peter the Great had a habit of snuffing. Everyone, like monkeys, would have rushed to repeat after him. But if there was ordinary tobacco in snuff boxes, this fashion would quickly disappear. Literally, in 1 year. But everything changes if you put another substance in the snuff box. Then the balls will shine with different colors and will be indistinguishable from discos in Ibiza. And people will not voluntarily give up such a habit. So what did the people of the 18th and 19th centuries smoke, sniff and drink? And why did the so-called tobacco come to Russia from India and China? And these deliveries were controlled by English, Spanish and Dutch merchants. Of course, skeptical citizens may not object. Like you say yourself, that the whole story up to the 19th century was invented. The fact that Peter took snuff is simply an unconfirmed historical curiosity. And no one in Russia has smelled anything. That's how it is. Peter is quite a mythical character here. But apart from the mythical characters, we have preserved the most important thing, namely the real artifacts, the so-called snuff boxes. It was with such a snuff box that Paul I was killed. And of course, it was not tobacco that killed him, but a blow to the temple with a golden snuff box. So, by our time, tens of thousands of snuff boxes for snuff have been preserved. And if there are so many of them, it means that just everyone sniffed tobacco. Starting from ordinary sailors, ending with maids of honor and tutors. But, as I said above, people do not like to do those actions that do not bring pleasure. There are a lot of snuff boxes preserved. So, people got some kind of pleasure. And here, we need to go back to history. Recall the West End Company, tea clippers, which everyone was very much waiting for, and which probably transported ordinary tea. But the British loved this tea so much that they simply could not wait a second for a new supply of tea. And that's why the fastest sailboats carried tea. Just some kind of magic tea. The habituation went from the first cup. And that's what's important in this story. Tea, tobacco and Aden are not exactly what historians tell us about. We have all heard about the Opium Wars in China, but it seems that wars were fought in Russia, Europe and America because of similar substances. And the population of these countries was artificially hooked on a rather strange drug. Look, there is a very interesting gap in the history of such a plant as coca. In the 16th century, the Spaniards who captured South America learned about the tonic properties of coca leaves. The desire for these leaves increased stamina, relieved fatigue and hunger. In general, the Spaniards learned about a miracle drug that was successfully used in silver mines, giving this potion to workers, which increased labor productivity. Everything seems to be fine here. A very useful plant for slaveholders. The efficiency of slave labor increases several times. But here's what's weird. According to historians, the Spaniards seemed in no hurry to tell the whole world about their discovery. Only a few descriptions of the action of this wonderful plant have been preserved by Europeans. This is what the Jesuit Blas Valera wrote in 1609 year. A cook is a kind of tree with the height and thickness of a vine. The Indians like cook so much that they value gold and silver and precious stones below her. They plant it with great attention and care. The Indians who eat it show more strength and more predisposition to work. They work all day without food. Cook protects against many diseases, and our enemies use it, grinding it into powder, to heal inflamed ulcers, strengthen broken bones, remove chills from the body, and treat rotting ulcers full of worms. The first mention of coca in scientific works dates back to 1808 year, and belongs to the German botanist Hermann Bergavius. In 1814 year, the British Gentleman's Magazine called on scientists to start studying the plant closely, so that a person could use coca instead of food, from time to time stopping eating if necessary. In the middle of the 19th century, tonic drinks containing tincture on coca leaves began to appear in Europe. In 1863 year, chemist Angelo Mariani began the production of wine, called Mariani wine, a kind of tincture on coca leaves, in which alcohol served as a solvent, contributing to the release of cocaine from the leaves. Pope Leo XIII carried a flask of Mariana cocaine wine with him everywhere. He awarded the creator of the drink a gold star of the Vatican. Marianne himself claimed that he was ready to publish 13 volumes of gratitude from consumers, including politicians, actors, and almost all doctors serving the royal families of Europe. In 1883 year, Theodor Aschenbrand recommended cocaine for use by soldiers of the Bavarian army. In 1884, Sigmund Freud conducted experiments on himself and published an article by Ubercola, in which he promoted cocaine as a cure for depression, various neuroses, syphilis, alcoholism, morphine addiction, sexual disorders, and began using coca in his psychotherapeutic practice. In 1876, coca leaves were used as sports doping. Up to 1885 year, British masters of athletic walking chewed coca leaves on the move, thus achieving improved results. Since the 1880s, cocaine has revolutionized anesthesia and has been considered by doctors as a kind of panacea. Hundreds of medicines have appeared on the market. They began to be used in traumatology, gynecology, advertised as a means for all occasions. Some drugs against hay fever and asthma, except for cocaine, did not contain anything at all. In 1900th year, in the United States, cocaine entered the top 5 best-selling drugs. In 1885, the popular Coca-Cola drink entered the market. The composition of the drink included coca leaves and cola nuts. Coca was withdrawn from the composition only after 20 years. In short, by the end of the 19th century, tens of millions of people were using cocaine in one form or another. Of course, we condemn all of this. But that's not the point. Look, it's the middle of the 16th century. The Spaniards successfully used coca leaves as a powerful stimulant for slaves. Coca is very convenient. You can chew, you can dissolve in wine, you can smoke. And it would seem, slaveholders all over the world should have immediately seized on this product. After all, hidden slavery flourished from England to Lopotnaya, Russia. What could be simpler? Feed the peasants coca and milk the Trinity. Well, that's what's strange. According to historians, there was no mass demand for coca in Europe until the middle of the 19th century, and the coca boom occurred only in the second half of the 19th century. This is all good, of course, but for whom, in the 16th century, the Spaniards grew 13,000 tons of cocoa a year? It was the Spaniards. Look, before the arrival of the Spaniards in Peru, coca was collected by the Indians in small volumes. The Spaniards came and began to expel the Indians by force in the coca-growing areas for its collection and harvesting. The Catholic Bishop of Cusco imposed a 10% tax on each coca crop. Coca in the 16th century was harvested in huge quantities, which exceeded the needs of the local population by thousands of times. Now the main question, the 16th century. There is still no demand for coca in Europe and North America. The Spaniards harvest coca on a huge scale. The Catholic Church even takes tithes with coca leaves. For whom was this product prepared? In 1567th year, a well-known lawyer and supporter of coca cultivation declared, if there were no coca, there would be no Peru, since coca was one of the most important sources of income for the Viceroyalty of Peru, and accordingly, the Spanish Empire. And here we again come to a historical dead end. On the one hand, historians tell us that back in the 16th century, coca was a strategic commodity for the Spanish Empire, and it was exported by thousands of tons. On the other hand, we do not have markets for these wonderful products. Neither Europe nor North America, and not yet fans of coca leaves. The demand for coca leaves, according to the official version, appeared only 250 years later, in the middle of the 19th century. So where did the Spaniards sell coke before the 19th century? And here, we need to look for how historians hid the large-scale drug trafficking of the 17th and 18th centuries. After all, you must agree, if there is a product that is collected by thousands of tons in the 16th century, then someone bought this product, but historians for some reason do not tell us about this buyers. And I probably know why. After all, coca leaves are just the tip of the iceberg. The 17th and 18th centuries were much more fun than historians tell us. And not only the Spaniards were engaged in the process of harvesting the necessary substances, but more on that later. In 1566 year, Jean Villain sends snuff to Ekaterina Medic as a cure for headaches. It seems to me that this is a rather strange act. I don't think inhaling regular tobacco will help with headaches. But, if we assume that this is an unusual tobacco, but Peruvian, then everything will fall into place. Coca leaves can not only be planted, which of course I condemn, but also sniffed. In some regions in Colombia, the unusual practice of using coca has persisted. The powder, which is formed after burning coca leaves, is sniffed. So, it is quite possible that this powder was sent to Ekaterina Medic. And we are smoothly moving on to the products that Peru massively supplied to the world market back in the 17th century, namely Peruvian tobacco. Under this name, coca was sold all over the world. There is nothing about this in the history textbooks, but these snuff boxes for snuff have been preserved. And on the lid, we see wonderful coca leaves. In other words, historians tell us that people in the 17th-18th century actively sniffed tobacco. Only now, they forgot to specify what kind of tobacco it is. I do not know why they are so shy, but all the facts say that this is Peruvian tobacco, that is, coca leaves cooked in a special way. Here is another indirect confirmation. Tobacco was sniffed everywhere, and in huge volumes, until the beginning of the 20th century. But for some reason, no one grows snuff today. They don't grow it because there is no demand. And there is no demand because no one has sniffed ordinary tobacco. For a very simple reason, this action does not cause any additional pleasant sensations. Rather, on the contrary, it draws ordinary tobacco through the nose rather unpleasantly. So, since the end of the 16th century, the Spaniards have regularly supplied the whole world with Peruvian tobacco of three types: snuff, smoking, and chewing. Let's start with chewing. He puzzled me even as a child, when he read in books about pirates that they constantly chewed tobacco. Of course, none of the authors specified the composition of tobacco, but, if we look at the records of 1860 of Virginia and North Carolina, and these were the centers of the tobacco industry, we will see that in these states there were 348 factories producing tobacco, and only 6 factories out of 348 produced smoking tobacco. 342 factories produced only chewing gum. Now chewing tobacco is completely unpopular, for a very simple reason. At the beginning of the 20th century, coca leaves were removed from its composition. And here are interesting excerpts from dictionaries. They drink tobacco, tobacco and saw, which intersect with this quote. Cuckoo, aka Peruvian tobacco, for example, you can drink mate de coca, mate tea and skokie. This particular mate was supplied from South America by the Jesuits. And as soon as the order was dispersed, the secret of the most popular drink was lost. Now let's see what was going on with another very popular product with a simple name: tea. For some reason, it was for the sake of tea that the fastest ships were sent to Southeast Asia. In 1851 year, a law was passed in England that significantly restricted the sale of wine, alcohol, beer and other alcoholic beverages, but supported the sale of tea, coffee, chocolate, cocoa, and lemonade. This law also became known as the 5 o'clock law, since it had a clause that stated that all employees, workers, and sailors must take a 15-minute break for tea at exactly 17 o'clock. At first glance, this is a very good law. The government takes care of the health of citizens, weans people from alcoholism, and teaches them to tea. The law is good for everyone, but that's what's strange. Where can we see that the government cares so much about the health of citizens? The functions of governments have not changed for hundreds of years. That in the 17th century, that in the 21st. The task of governments is simple, to make a citizen work as much as possible, and at the same time, create the appearance that a citizen is not a slave. So, I don't really believe that in the middle of the 19th century in England, someone was thinking about the health of citizens. Even in the 20th century, they sent teenagers to Australia to explore the desert lands and apologized only 50 years later. What can we say about the 19th, when the same English children worked in the coal mines for 12 hours? And here there is such concern for people. Do not drink alcohol, as it interferes with work. Drink tea every day. Yes, but I wonder what kind of tea was imported to England for workers. For example, the taste of dried Bolivian coca leaves tastes very much like Chinese green tea. But it was not only England that cared about the health of its workers. In 1910th year, black workers in the United States received cocaine from their employers to improve their performance. By a strange coincidence, the famous tea clipper races began almost simultaneously with the FIFO law. Well, that's what's strange. Tea, which cost 1 shilling a pound, is carried on the best clippers, competing with each other. Opium, which cost 3 gold guineas per pound, for some reason is not carried on clippers. At the same time, tea in some parts of history has an amazing sales dynamics. In 1700 and the first year, 30 tons of tea were sold in England, and 3 years later, sales increased to 300 tons. Such a tenfold increase is characteristic of drugs. In the 2009 year, the British consumed 2.5 kilograms of tea per year per capita. Everyone knows that we began to live better in the 20th century. But for some reason, tea consumption has decreased. 2009 year, 2.5 kilograms, 1897th year, 4 kilograms. That is, before tea was consumed almost twice as much. What is the reason for the decrease in consumption? Maybe, like chewing tobacco, a tonic supplement was removed from it. Let's leave England alone for now and deal with another interesting mystery. Everyone knows that it was the Spaniards who exported silver from South America. But not everyone knows that silver from America did not go straight to Spain. He was taken to the Philippines for some reason. Look at how illogical everything is with us. Instead of bringing valuable goods directly to Spain, galleons with silver are sent to the ass of the world, Manila. There, silver is exchanged for some extra valuable spices. Spices are loaded onto galleons, which again go to South America, to the city of Acapulco. In Acapulco, cargo was loaded onto carts and transported to the city of Veracruz on the Gulf Coast. And already from Veracruz, spices went to Spain. Just an amazing scheme. This is more like the action of some transnational corporation. But there is one weak link in this story, or rather, one widely publicized myth called Oriental spice. And this is a very interesting myth. Even as a child, I was interested in the question of how the trade in pepper and other spices can boost the economy of entire countries, such as Holland, Belgium, Portugal. For historians, everything is simple. The Netherlands lived quite poorly, but suddenly began to carry pepper from Southeast Asia, and immediately turned into the richest country in the world. But this, of course, I exaggerated everything a lot. But this does not change the fact that the largest Eastern trading company was born in a fairly small country. And this company received the main profit from the spice trade. That's what historians write. On the Mock Islands, such spices as cloves were purchased and resold at a price 7 times higher than the purchase price. Pepper was purchased in Java and Sumatra and sold in Holland for 10 times more expensive. All of this, of course, is beautiful. We bought pepper for a ruble, sold it for 10. Just super profit. And of course, the largest trading East Indian company grew out of such profits. So it's just that I want to ask respected historians, who was the final consumer of all these spices? If you look at the paintings of artists of the 17th century, we see universal poverty everywhere. People are dirty, poorly dressed, malnourished. And this is the situation all over Europe. There is, of course, a small percentage of wealthy citizens, but the total mass, 90% of the population of Europe, are just poor people, for whom they are just lucky to have something to eat. And to eat not even meat, but some kind of trousers. And after such pictures, historians try to assure me that these poor people bought cinnamon, cloves and pepper by thousands of tons. Why does a beggar need cinnamon? He would like a piece of meat and a little salt, that's all. How could such people afford exotic condiments? But it was on spices that the East Indian Company grew up. To whom did she sell hundreds of thousands of tons of spices? Who is the end user? In the world, of course, there are spices that will be bought always and in any financial situation. Even today, there is an exemplary quarter in Philadelphia, where people are ready to live almost in garbage cans, but they will buy such a spice. Watch a video on this topic under the video. So, only drug trafficking can create such frenzied turns. In the beginning, we teach people to a certain spice, and then we carry this spice by hundreds of thousands of tons. And that's how it was. From the 16th to the 19th century, about 80% of all silver was mined in Mexico and Peru. The silver went straight to the Philippines. About 40% of the silver was deposited in China. And what could be exchanged for silver in China? On porcelain, opium and tea. Porcelain from China was low-grade, and was used as ballast, so that the loaded ship would not capsize. There is also, however, the myth of Chinese silk. There is a myth, but there are simply no statistics on the silk trade. Of course, the Spaniards could carry tea. Everyone has heard about English tea, but for some reason no one talks about Spanish. And this is strange, because the British are the same intermediaries. It turns out that the most profitable for the return flight is opium. At first glance, it all sounds fantastic. But our reality is much more interesting than any fantasy. In 1773 year, the Jesuit order was destroyed, and most of all, the Pope was dissatisfied with the order's policy in India and China. In the same year, the British Governor-General of Bengal destroyed the Patna Syndicate and established the monopoly of the East India Company on the Bengal opium trade. Now let's look at the coat of arms of the Jesuit order. 1608th year. And what do we see in the center of the coat of arms? Properly incised poppy head. And here is the icon of the Madonna with a poppy. So here we see a very interesting trans-world corporation, in which either the Jesuits worked or the Jesuits used to run it. But the corporation's goals are very clear: the extraction and distribution of various narcotic substances. Coca was mined in Peru and distributed all over the world under the guise of Peruvian tobacco. Peruvian slaves, under the influence of the same coca, mined silver, which went to Southeast Asia and was exchanged for Chinese opium. But where was the opium supplied? Numerous religious organizations around the world have become the main consumer of opium. Think about such a simple word as incense. Fumigate incense. And now look at the name of modern incense. And it is called oliban. That is, an aromatic resin obtained from 3 species of trees of the genus Basvilleu. Oliban is not consonant with the word laude. Let's look for a consonant word. This is the word laudanu, that is tincture of opi. In the Latin dictionary, and Louis Short's words, laudanum lidinum, is translated not as opium, but as incense. So incense is opium. We see indirect confirmation from Dahl. Valerian is a feline lotta, cats love him, meow, fool, and almost get mad from him. So, since the 16th century, some kind of transcorporation in the beginning hooked the whole world on Peruvian tobacco, that is, coca leaves, and closer to the 19th, on opium. Opium was used in new churches to lure believers there, or rather to make them want to return to this place as soon as possible. Remember the famous phrase, "Religion is the opium of the people." I used to think it was a metaphor, but it seems quite recently it was reality. People were fumigated with incense. Also, the so-called super profitable spice trade is just another branch of drug trafficking. The Austin Company, like a small horse, was carrying consumers, so it is necessary, and at the moment substances. And this is not only opium and cola, there is also a third element that was very widespread around the world, but I will tell you about it next time. In the meantime, we'll get back to China. Historians say that in the 19th century, China was the main consumer of opium. There are no real figures for the 19th century, but interesting conclusions can be drawn from the figures of the early 20th century. 1906th year, China produces 35,000 tons of opium, that is 93% of global production. Historians say that the Chinese used all this opium on the spot. That is, residents of one country smoked 35,000 tons of potion. To understand how much it is necessary to determine the volume of the standard dose. This will help us count the Russian traveler Mikluko who smoked opium in an ordinary Chinese smokehouse. It says that the size of the smoking dose is comparable to a professional grain, that is, it is equal to about 5 milligrams. This means that in 1906th year, 7 trillion DOS were produced in China. This amount would be enough for every person who lived on Earth at that time. The population at that time was 1,650,000,000 people, to receive 12 DOS daily. In other words, the Chinese people simply could not physically consume all the opium that was produced on their territory. And this means that opium was exported somewhere. All these stories with opium warriors do not quite accurately convey the meaning of the events actually taking place. We are told that the First Opium War of 1840th year was fought between the British and the Qing Empire. There was allegedly a huge trade imbalance. Simply put, China sold more goods abroad than it bought itself. He sold mythical silk, low-quality porcelain. With porcelain, the topic is also very interesting. It is necessary to illuminate it in the future. Tea was also coming from China, but the tea didn't seem to be very simple. So, the export of tea, porcelain and silk was so successful that China just ate in front of our eyes. This, of course, could not but upset the British. The only thing they could offer the hardworking Chinese was opium. And they took contraband to China. But in 1830, China put an end to the smuggling of English opera with harsh measures. In 1840th year, the First Opium War began, which China lost. Then there was the Second Opium War, which China also lost, which eventually led to the opening of the Chinese market for English opium. As a result, China's economy collapsed because silk, tea, porcelain were exported from China, and English opium was imported. In short, according to historians, the Chinese became drug addicts and simply smoked their wealth. All of this, of course, is logical. Hardworking Chinese, who loved opium very much. The wise Chinese ruler, who forbade this opium to be imported. Cunning Englishmen, who sold opium to the unfortunate coolies. As a result, the collapse of the empire. That's the way it is, But here's what's strange. In the 19th century, China was actually not an importer, but an exporter of opium. In other words, China was a huge plantation for growing opium. This is clearly seen in the year 1906, because it is impossible to grow such crops without having experience, a sowing base, and trained personnel. In 1906 year, China produced 90% of the world's opium reserves. In other words, we see that this country is a stable exporter, and in China were able to grow. And a huge mass of the Chinese population was involved in this business. Judging by the harvest at the beginning of the 20th century, the has been cultivated in China for centuries. And if every peasant produces a product, then how can this peasant be sold exactly the same product with the same properties, but at a much higher price? But historians tell us about the cunning Englishman who smuggled opium to China. Now I repeat, how could English opium be sold if the Chinese had plenty of their own opium? And here we are again faced with an obvious falsification of history in favor of multinational corporations who invented a fairy tale that China was the largest consumer of opium in the 19th century. But in fact, our unsightly past was hidden under this fairy tale. Transnational corporations exported opium and other narcotic substances from China and other Southeast Asian countries. It was on the sale of opium that China's economy rose in the 18th century. We are told about the super popular Chinese tea. But here it's not about tea, it's about opium. And it is quite possible that, in the middle of the 19th century, England was waging opium wars with China, or with another corporation. Of course, there could have been wars, but these wars are not a struggle for the Chinese domestic market. It's different here. This is a struggle for control over China's cultivated areas. In other words, the two corporations could not share the huge opium fields located in China. Here, of course, one can object, there are real statistics that at the beginning of the 20th century, there were several million drug addicts in China. And here I agree with you. Yes, there are a lot of drug addicts in China. And what did you want? Opium has been grown on an industrial scale in the country for centuries. And this, of course, will lead to a part of the population getting hooked on this product. It's like in Colombia. After all, no one is surprised that there are a lot of drug addicts there. Colombia is a production site. Naturally, part of the population uses a product intended for export to other countries. So China was a raw material base, and from there, opium was supplied to other countries. The video has dragged on for something. I'd better continue next time. That's it. Watch my channel.